Welcome to Movie Slice. Quick, fun recaps of your favorite movies, sharp, funny, and to the point. Hit subscribe and get your perfect slice of cinema. The movie Teen Wolf begins with Scott, who plays basketball on the Beavers team, can barely catch his breath from all the tension. He's standing there getting ready to take a free throw in the game against the Dragons, and the more he tries to focus, the more he misses the shot. The game is heating up and Scott gets pushed and falls to the ground by Mike, the rival, who always targets. Now he's bleeding, and it's Mike himself who helps him up. He asks for a short break to pull himself together, but Coach Finstock, the Beavers coach, says they should just forfeit the game because the score difference is huge. They're losing by more than 40 points. But Miss Thorne, the school principal, refuses and tells them to keep playing, so the match continues for barely 2 more minutes. Finstock keeps complaining to Thorne, saying the reason for the loss is that they don't have proper sports shoes. After a while, Scott faces the same guy who knocked him down, and they keep fighting for the ball for a bit until suddenly Scott growls in his face, which intimidates the opponent and he lets go of the ball. Scott grabs it and runs toward the basket. Time is almost up, less than 10 seconds left, and this is the last chance to score. Everyone is focused on his shot, but unfortunately the ball hits the rim and bounces out. The hope that was there turns into disappointment, and all the players start to feel down and slump their shoulders from exhaustion and defeat. After the match, Scott and the team head back to the locker room. Chubby, the overweight player, tries to act tough and says he's on a diet, but Scott approaches him and pulls out some snacks he'd hidden behind something, chocolate chips, and Chubby gets annoyed and yells at him. After a while, Styles, Scott's close friend, enters the locker room, cheering and acting like they'd won. Scott reminds him they lost, but Styles just comes over and starts talking about how he wants to get beer so they can get into a party. Then he leaves Scott and goes to joke around with the other players. At that moment, Scott notices a really long hair on Styles' shoulder and pulls it out, weirded out. Without wasting time, Scott leaves Styles and the players, and heads to Coach Finstock's office. He knocks, enters, and tells the coach he's been thinking about what he said about coming to him if they have any problems. Finstock gives him a chance to talk, and Scott tells him he's going through changes that won't let him keep playing on the team. Finstock, thinking he understands everything, assumes Scott is just scared and starts telling him a story about another student who also wanted to quit the team. While listening, Scott realizes the story has nothing to do with what he's going through, so he politely thanks the coach and excuses himself. He leaves the school with his childhood friend, Lisa. Everyone calls her Boof, and they start talking as they walk about how bad the game was. On the way, Scott tells her he had a weird dream with her and Pamela, the girl he likes, and some chickens. Then he starts venting about how he feels ordinary and average at everything, not special at all. He keeps complaining that from his point of view everything in Beacon Town is ordinary and tasteless, even their basketball team. Suddenly, he stops Boof and asks her if there's something wrong with him, but she doesn't have a clear answer. Scott is surprised and can't believe it, especially since even Pamela doesn't notice him or pay him any attention, which makes him feel like something is really missing. This upsets Boof, and she angrily tells him he could be much better than Pamela. When he confronts her about her words, she tries to joke and change the subject, reminding him he has work to go to. At that moment, Scott goes into his dad's hardware store, where there are customers coming in. Suddenly, he hears a sound coming from a little boy playing with his dog, and a dog whistle. Scott manages to track the sound, lightly taps the boy on the head, and takes the whistle, surprised he could hear it in the first place. Then he goes to pick up an order for Kirk, the theater director at their school, and his hands are literally full of stuff. As he's walking down the school hallway, things start to fall from his hands one by one, and to make matters worse, he bumps into Principal Thorne, but manages to pull himself together and keep going. When he enters the auditorium, Kirk is watching Pamela rehearse for the play, and is correcting her performance with great attention. Scott comes in at that moment, introduces himself to Kirk, and asks if he can take Pamela to the party that night. While talking, he notices thick, long hair suddenly appearing on his hand, so he quickly drops everything, hides his hand, and gives her back her stuff so no one sees. Scott tries to convince Pamela to come to the party, but suddenly Mike appears, making it clear he's dating Pam. The two of them leave together, and Scott is left standing alone, picking up the stuff he brought from the hardware store. A bit later, Styles continues his quest to get a keg of beer from Tony's liquor store, but Tony isn't easily fooled. As soon as he sees Styles too eager, he asks to see his ID, and Styles realizes it's pointless, and decides to leave. That night, Scott sits with Boof, and tells her he wants to quit the basketball team, and join the school theater group. He almost starts telling her about the weird things happening to him, but Styles comes in and interrupts. Scott doesn't wait, and leaves with him in the car. On the way, they pick up Lewis, who's coming with them to the party. While driving, they pass by Tony's store again, and Styles suggests Scott steal the keg, using a toy gun, but Scott throws the gun away, and says he doesn't need that. Inside the store, they line up, and as soon as Tony sees him, he gets nervous and starts yelling. At that moment, Scott's eyes turn red, and all he does is ask for the keg. Tony gets so scared he fetches it himself. After that, the three of them get into two cars, Scott and Lewis, in the hardware store van, and Styles in the convertible with the keg next to him on the seat. On the way, they talk about Pamela, and how Mike is still at school because he was in jail. Styles tells them to switch places with Lewis, and after a moment, he takes off his shoes, pulls out the mesh, and climbs onto the roof of the car, his hair flying in the wind, looking like he's having a blast. But Scott is the opposite. When he looks in the side mirror, he sees his ears have become long and pointed. He gets startled, and the car swerves a bit, causing Styles to fly off the roof. When Scott looks again, his ears are back to normal, and Styles is standing on the roof, as if nothing happened. Anyway, they arrive at the party, which is crowded and full of young people wanting to have fun. Styles gets out of the car, and he and Scott swap jackets, and carry the keg inside. As soon as Scott goes in, he starts looking for Pamela, only for her to mock him for being quiet and reserved after she snubs him, as if she wants to make things worse for him. Then, the party-goers start a strange game, where the girls take random boys' names, and Styles draws a name from a whoever's name comes up has to do a challenge with the girl. The first challenges involve whipped cream fights, and then Chubby eats a whole jelly plate in front of people. Boof gets a boy named Malcolm, but when it's Pamela, she rolls her eyes when she discovers his name is Scott, who appeared for her. At that moment, Scott looks like a crumpled, sweaty dollar bill, but no one notices. Styles, who started to slur a bit from drinking too much, decides to call Boof to distract her, and that's when Pamela admits that she got Everyone pretends like nothing happened, and they all act casual, until they reach the closet. Styles shouts, 2 minutes in heaven, which means the boy and girl get a chance to be alone without anyone watching. They push them into the closet, and shut the door amid laughter and cheer. To keep things fair, Styles calls the next two, and dares the boy to take a cup to the principal, and ask for a urine sample. Meanwhile, inside the closet, Scott tells Boof he feels strange things, but she reassures him, thinking it's just an awkward moment, trying to calm things down. They manage to ease the tension a bit, but suddenly something unnatural happens. Scott starts running his nails, which now look like blades, down Boof's back. The guys outside notice the silence, especially Styles, who decides to open the door. But the tension between Boof and Scott starts to ease, and Boof gives a small smile as she returns to the group, with cuts on her back from Scott's scratch. That same night, Scott rushes home, runs past his dad as if he's heading to the bathroom. As soon as he enters the bathroom, he starts washing his face, and tries to stop himself from changing, due to the strange transformations happening to him. After a few seconds, he notices fangs starting to appear where his front teeth were. Every time he looks away from the mirror, he discovers a new development. His skin becomes rough, his nails turn into claws, his ears become pointed, and worst of all, his whole body is almost covered in thick hair. Scott can't recognize himself in the mirror, and is so terrified that he presses himself against the bathroom door. At that moment, his father knocks on the door and asks, "What's wrong?" Scott tries to ignore his dad, and tells him to leave him alone, but his father starts speaking seriously, and tells him to open the door immediately. Imagine Scott's shock when he opens the door to find his father's body also covered in hair. Harold, the father, knows he has a lot to explain, but before he can open his mouth, Scott bombards him with a ton of questions. It turns out that the gene that turns them into werewolves can skip a generation, and Harold thought his son wouldn't get it, but unfortunately it happened. Scott explodes with anger, pushes past his father, and slams the door violently behind him. The next morning, Scott comes down for breakfast, and his father gives him a cup of cocoa to calm his nerves, and they start talking about the whole situation. Harold begins to explain how the transformation, and being a werewolf, comes with great power, but he doesn't forget to remind him that this power also comes with great responsibility. It turns out that his wife, Scott's mother, even taught him how to live with it, and Harold is optimistic that Scott will be able to do the same, but all this talk doesn't comfort, and from his perspective, he already has enough problems and doesn't need another one of this magnitude. Scott leaves the house, and goes to school, feeling totally out of it. After recess, Styles goes back to his locker, which is full to the brim. As soon as he opens it, everything falls out, and he gets a complete mess in his head. After a few seconds, Scott arrives with Pamela, who looks at him with suspicion.
sensing something has changed about him, but she concludes that maybe it's just his hair that looks different. The atmosphere becomes more tense when Boof appears and asks him why he didn't come to lunch with her. The day is very strange for Scott. He can't focus in any class, keeps zoning out and falling asleep, and feels like nothing the teachers say makes sense. At one point, the teacher calls him to the board to solve a physics problem, but Scott starts to feel lost and confused. His nails turn into claws, and suddenly he realizes things could go really badly if he runs out of the classroom as if someone is chasing him, and goes into the boys' bathroom in the art department, stands in front of the mirror begging himself not to transform, sweat pouring down his face. Suddenly, the vice principal, Mr. Thorne, comes in and asks to see his hand. Luckily, he was just looking for someone who had been scratching the walls with a marker. At that moment, Scott's claws turn back into nails. He shows his hands, and everything passes safely. The bell rings, and Scott takes the opportunity to run out quick. Later that day, he goes to Styles' place in his family's garage. While Styles is looking for things that shouldn't be there, Scott blurts it out without beating around the bush. "I'm aware." At first, Styles thinks Scott is joking, but when Scott turns his face towards him, Styles is completely shocked, standing speechless for a few moments. After he pulls himself together, he asks, "So you can turn whenever you want?" All the possibilities of a werewolf, unleashed from Styles' perspective. Scott has become something else, looking beautiful and unnaturally strong. Scott goes home and finds his dad and his dad's friend playing basketball together. He goes to them, thinking his dad will say something, but the truth is, the man is happy and feels no guilt. All he's doing is enjoying his time. Suddenly, Boof tells Scott, "Let's walk home." He agrees and walks with. As they walk, they talk about old topics, like how he still likes her friend, and how, when they were 5, they once ran away from home and no one noticed. Suddenly, Boof stops, turns to him calmly, grabs his jacket, and gently says, "I'm here if you want to talk." But Scott feels she won't understand him this time, so he says so indirectly, and leaves. Game day comes again, this time the Beavers team against the Cadets. Boof and Styles attend the game, and cheer for Scott before they go to their seat. Unfortunately, Scott gets pushed and falls in the first few minutes. Luckily, the team gets a free throw. He stands to shoot, and as usual, misses the first one, but he gets a second chance, and here his eyes glow red, and he uses his werewolf ability. He throws the ball, and it goes into the net, as if pulled by a magnet. Suddenly, he finds himself surrounded by 6 players trying to take the ball from him. He starts growling, and with all the pushing and shoving, he emerges from the crowd as a full werewolf, in every sense of the word, hair covering almost his entire body.
The whole gym goes silent. Even Vice Principal Thorne can't say a word. Scott starts dribbling the ball with his hand, looking into the eyes of anyone brave enough to meet his gaze. No one moves, and Scott charges toward the basket and dunks the ball with a rocket-like slam as if to say, "I'm here, and no one can stop me." The referee, still not understanding what's going on, blows the whistle and counts the goal for the Beavers. The players kneel, and the game continues, and Scott scores again. The Beavers, who haven't won a game in 3 years, now see Scott as their Superman. Basketball, and they completely forgot that he was a werewolf and dangerous, but it turned out to be in their favor. The match continued, and Scott was brilliant. He was stealing the ball from the other team, and scoring in the basket as easily as a duck in water or a biscuit in tea. The team had never scored this many goals since it was founded. After the match, the players carried Scott on their shoulders and took him to a restaurant to celebrate, and Pamela sat next to him so closely that Mike was so jealous. Scott even got free food. From that moment, everything changed. People he didn't know were greeting him. Girls were falling for him in droves. The school principal, Thorne, tried to threaten him, but Scott didn't care. All he did was walk away calmly. Every day, there was a new match and a new win. The cheerleaders sang for him, and the team mascot took off his beaver suit and put on a wolf one. After the win, a bunch of kids attacked him to get his autograph. When the exam results came out, Styles got a D-, and Scott got an A with complete E. At lunchtime, Scott and Boof went down the stairs together, and Boof started talking about all the gains he got from being a werewolf. Scott tried to be humble, but neither she nor Pamela, who came and told him that Mr. Kirka wanted him to act in the school play, helped him keep his humility. She gave him a look full of judgment, left and walked away. In rehearsal, Pamela performed her part, but Scott did what was required of him, and that was it. Still, Mr. Kirka didn't criticize him. Right after Pamela invited him to her dressing room, Scott entered normally, in his human form. She obviously wanted him to transform and did everything she could to bring out the werewolf inside him, and she succeeded. He came out of the corner howling with joy, and Principal Thorne heard him while he was still there. At night, all the guys went bowling. Scott hit 5 strikes in a row, something that never happened before. He and Pamela became very close and didn't try to hide their relationship. Not even from Mike, who was burning with jealousy. Pamela didn't care that Scott didn't even know Mike would be at the bowling alley. Boof tried bowling and failed miserably in front of everyone. Scott tried to help and encourage her, but Mike couldn't stand seeing Scott holding her that way. He went up to him with a look of arrogance. And not only that, he started insulting Scott, accusing him of finishing her off when she was stealing chickens from his yard. Scott got really angry, but instead of hitting him, he struck a bowling ball with all his strength and smashed it, leaving everyone silent. After bowling, he walked Pamela home, but as soon as they arrived, she coldly told him, "Mike is still my boyfriend." Scott didn't understand. He was planning to ask her to the spring dance, especially since they'd spent the whole day together, but Pamela turned out to be playing both sides, making it clear that the day meant nothing to her, and left him standing at her door, not understanding anything. On the day of another match, Chubby brought an apple, knowing Scott would win the match on his own, and he wasn't wrong. Chubby and Brad stood on the side while Scott scored all the goals until they won, but Chubby and Brad were upset with him, and when he went to them afterward to celebrate, they both refused to go out with him without even thinking. Captain Finstock didn't say anything about what was happening, only wanting to keep the winning streak going. Afterward, Scott decided to go see Styles, but was surprised to find his friend had a new car. It turned out he'd gotten a convertible, and put a big sign on it, Wolfmobile. Scott liked it, but couldn't stop thinking about Lewis, whom he hadn't seen in a while. Styles wondered if Lewis was afraid of him, but didn't say a word, and Scott understood everything. To change the mood, Scott climbed onto the roof of the car, and started showing off his moves as they drove through town, doing handstands on the moving car as they passed by Scott's dad's hardware store. Returning home at night, his dad was doing taxes and asked, "Why haven't you been coming to the shop?" Scott apologized, saying he'd spent the day with Styles. His dad already knew and told him, "You've been making people laugh at you." The conversation turned into a heartfelt talk. Scott said he still couldn't control what was happening to him. His dad started telling him about his wife, how it ended, and the day they realized they were meant for each other. It turned out that Rusty Thorne, the school principal, used to love Harold's wife, and whether Harold threatened him or not, Rusty always hovered around her. One day, things got out of control, and Harold turned into a werewolf in front of Rusty Thorne. It was such a shock that Rusty almost wet himself. Scott said he would have given anything to witness that moment, but his dad didn't mean it that way. He only wanted Scott to know that he had to be present and in control when using his power. The next morning, Boof picked Scott up from his house to go to school together. As they walked quietly, she brought up the spring dance. Scott asked if she could be his date. Boof didn't mind but set one condition. He had to go to the dance as himself, not as the werewolf. Scott couldn't agree, so they decided to just dance together as friends. Since they'd known each other for so long, Boof couldn't say no. The day of the spring dance arrived. Scott wore a white suit, styled his fur, and entered the party, looking like he'd stepped out of a magazine. He gave a little howl for encouragement, then went inside. The students were dancing to loud music, but as soon as Scott entered, everything went quiet, and all eyes were on him. He gave out light greetings like a celebrity, then had to show them what he could do. Boof nodded to him to go ahead, and Scott did a famous Michael Jackson move from a music video. The whole crowd started copying him, and the party went wild. At that moment, Principal Thorne walked in, and saw what was happening. He couldn't believe his eyes at Scott's influence on the student. Amid the chaos, Boof took Scott aside and told him she needed the real version of him, even if only for half an hour. Meanwhile, Mike looked furious, and Pamela was trying to justify herself, saying she just wanted to dance with Scott and that was. While they were talking, Scott turned back to his human form, grabbed Boof by the hand, and took her to the dance floor to dance together. Suddenly, Mike came over and punched Scott in the face, repeating his threat to stay away from his girlfriend, and even insulted Boof. At that point, Scott couldn't take it. His eyes started to turn red as soon as Mike hit him. The students tried to warn him, but after a few moments, when Mike looked back at Scott, he had fully transformed into a werewolf again. Scott scratched Mike. They had to hold Mike back, so he wouldn't retaliate in the middle of the crowd. People started gossiping about the one who said Scott had become a beast, one of their own, standing there while all the Thorne school kids were smiling
as if his heart was happy with what was happening. Scott felt suffocated and couldn't take it anymore, so he ran out into the hallway and slammed the door. For a moment, he thought about going home, but Thorne followed him into the hallway, his tone hopeful that Scott would finally be expelled from school. Thorne grabbed him and pushed him against the wall, telling him to stay away from his son, glaring at him with a threatening look. He started to growl, and Thorne was so terrified. Life went on. Scott and Pamela kept rehearsing for the school play, but Scott was acting as himself, not as the wolf. Mr. Kirk stopped him in the middle of the performance and told him people wanted to see the wolf, not Scott. But Scott insisted on his position, and when given the choice to transform or give up the role, Scott left immediately. What happened at the spring party made Scott see the world differently. He decided to leave the basketball team. He was standing in the hallway, and Boof was trying to convince him to reconsider. After a while, Stiles came and joined him. As soon as he heard the news, he decided to do whatever it took to change Scott's mind. There were 4 hours left until the championship game, and Stiles was so proud of the team that he couldn't even show his face now. He found himself with Scott, who didn't want to transform again no matter what he said. Scott wasn't convinced, and when the game started, it was clear to everyone that the Beavers were going to lose. The other team was the Dragons, and Mike wasn't letting anyone. He knocked Brad down so hard that people were upset by the sight and had to carry him off the court. While they were still helping him, Scott entered the gym looking normal. Everyone turned to look at him as if they couldn't believe. Stiles looked the most disappointed, and Captain Finstock met him at the door and asked about the wolf. But Scott told him honestly, "I'll play like this, without transforming." The crowd started chanting, wanting the wolf, but Scott repeated, "I'll play for real." Scott returned to the court after hearing all the scenarios predicting they'd lose, but he confidently told them he believed they could actually win. After some encouragement and motivation, everyone got back on the court. Mike bumped into him, threatening to end the game. The ball reached Chubby, who was standing there not knowing what to do until Mike yelled at him, "Throw the ball, fat boy." The insult provoked him, so he threw the ball toward the basket, and he scored. That goal energized the rest of the Beavers. Half of them ran to defend, the other half to attack, and they started playing together like a real team for the first time. They were passing, defending, and scoring, and the point gap started to shrink bit by bit. But the Dragons were still trying to stay ahead, and even got a foul because they knocked Scott down, who then took a free throw. As soon as he got the ball, the crowd in the stands went wild, and the Beavers played as if their lives depended on it. After a while, the gap was just 10 points. Chubby scored another three-pointer, this time without even looking, and the crowd went wild with joy. Mike lost it too, knocking Scott down for the 4th time, but Scott just got up laughing, happy that Mike only had 1 foul left before being ejected from the game. The tension increased with every second, and the Beavers kept getting closer. Scott scored another point, and Chubby became a 3-point machine. There was only 1 minute left, and the score was 50-51 in favor of the Dragon. The Beavers had to defend for a whole minute, quickly passing the ball to Chubby, who immediately passed it back. But before he could play it, Mike pushed him to the ground. The referee blew the whistle, and the crowd, who had been cheering, all got angry and started cursing Mike as if he'd robbed a poor child. Rightfully, Scott got 2 free throws. He stood at the line, taking a deep breath, while Mike stood on the other side yelling and trying to distract him. But Scott wasn't affected. He focused on the basket and threw and scored. The score was now tied, 51-51, and the Beavers' entire future rested on one last free throw. Scott stood, prepared himself, and threw the ball. The whole crowd went silent, watching as it flew through the air. The ball fell through the net. In an instant, the whole hall erupted in joy. His teammates and the crowd rushed to celebrate him, lifting him on their shoulders and chanting his name, happiness filling the place. Even Chubby, the 3-point king, was lifted up amid the cheers and excitement. But she stood there, watching all this, wanting to approach Scott and talk to him, pushing her boyfriend Mike aside to reach him. But Scott didn't even notice her, as if she didn't exist, and went to Boof and hugged her. A real hug, feeling for the first time that he truly loved her, not anyone else. Finally, he ran to his father, who opened his arms with pride. If you liked today's video, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell to receive all new updates.